Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see you all here with us this afternoon. I'm Susan Collins, the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean here at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and it's great to have you here for today's lecture. We're looking forward to hearing from a very distinguished policymaker, scholar, and teacher, Dr. Douglas A. Brook. He is currently a professor of public policy and the director of the Center for Defense Management Research at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I'm very proud to note that Doug is also a distinguished alumnus of the Ford School, having earned his MPA here. Doug is teaching a course for us this term in public budgeting as our Towsley Foundation Policymaker in Residence. The Harry A. and Margaret D. Towsley Foundation Policymaker in Residence program was established in 2002 to bring individuals with significant policymaking experience to campus to interact with our students and our faculty. And the program is made possible by a very generous grant gift from the Towsley Foundation, and it's greatly enhanced our community over the years. We have really been delighted to be able to welcome those guests to our campus. It's wonderful that the chair of the Towsley Foundation could be with us here today, Ranny Reeker. Ranny is a terrific friend and supporter of the Ford School, and I'd like to thank her for the Foundation's gift that's helped to establish our Policymaker in Residence program. It's also a great pleasure for me to acknowledge that we have with us here today Judith Dow and Don Rummelhart, who are Towsley Foundation board members, and so we're delighted to have you join us. The printed program today includes a full biography for Dr. Brook, and you'll see it's quite impressive. I will encourage you to look through it at your leisure, but I thought I would just make a couple of additional remarks about his distinguished career. Doug's most recent presidential appointment was as acting Undersecretary of Defense, where he was responsible for the development and execution of the Defense Department's budget and for improving financial management across the department. Before that, Doug held a similar post as Senior Financial Officer for the U.S. Navy. That deep expertise in Defense Department budgeting makes Doug especially well qualified to speak about the strengths and perhaps some of the limitations in our current framework of accounting for U.S. spending on national security. In a time of ballooning federal budget deficits and two active military conflicts, it's clearly extremely important for policymakers to allocate resources strategically and to think broadly about the kinds of investments that could help to make this world a safer place. I want to briefly supplement Doug's official biography with some reflections about the contributions that he's made to the missions here at the Ford School. Just last month, the school was pleased and honored to present Doug with the Neil Stabler Alumni Service Award. The award was well earned. His career accomplishments reflect lifelong distinguished service and a commitment to effective public policy across a number of sectors, including the corporate world, academia, and the federal government. When interviewed recently for a Ford School podcast, and I encourage you all to go to our website, we have a number of interesting podcasts, including the one that I mention now, Doug said, and I quote, "The University of Michigan changed my life." Over the years, Doug has continually paid that impact forward, and he has been a steadfast champion for the value of the Ford School's work and the education and the training that we provide. He served for years on the Ford School's visiting committee, and he's demonstrated a consistent and ready willingness to mentor the next generation of policy professionals by coming back to give numerous career talks for our students and establishing several paid internships through which our students have gained invaluable hands-on experience. So I could not be more pleased to welcome our friend Doug Brook to the podium to speak with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Collins, for that kind introduction. I have returned to Ann Arbor an awful lot in recent years, sometimes to be here for football games and other times just to be here at the Ford School. This is a great opportunity for me to speak to you today as the Towsley Foundation Policy Maker in Residence, and I'm so grateful, Ranny, to the Harry A. and Margaret D. Towsley Foundation for their support not only of this policymaker residency program, but everything that you do for the Ford School. I also want to thank Dean Collins for inviting me here to be with you this fall. During my sentence as a dean a few years ago, I came to understand that being a dean means servant leadership, and thank you for your quiet, intelligent service that you give to the Ford School community. You know, it is an honor to be here as at the Ford School in this role as of policymaker in residence. But I have to tell you, this is certainly not something that would have been predicted 42 years ago for, at best, a modestly successful graduate of the Institute for Public Administration. To channel Yogi Berra for a minute, if the IPA faculty were still alive, they would be turning in their graves. I recall that upon graduation, my classmates and I were heavily recruited by the state government to go to Lansing and become budget analysts, and I was so not interested in that option that instead I went and I enlisted in the Navy. So I'm enjoying this delightful irony of being here this semester talking to you about national security and teaching a course in public budgeting, and I see some students from Public Policy 715 here. Thank you for coming. Your class participation grades are going up as a result. As Dean Collins said, I've often said that this university and this school changed my life. I've refined that observation just a bit. This university changed my life. This school defined my professional life. I was the first child anywhere in my extended family to attend college. I am the Michigan story. At the end of the first 5-week freshman grading period of my freshman year, my parents received a letter from the dean telling them that my grades were unsatisfactory and the prospects for my academic survival at Michigan were dim. Well, notwithstanding that shaky start, I did survive, and in the process, this university changed me forever. The Ford School, or its predecessors, IPA and later IPS, on the other hand, set me on a career course that has now brought me all the way back to you as policymaker in residence. No matter where I've worked, in and out of government, I have always thought of myself as working in the public policy arena, relying on the education and the public service values that I gained here. But you know, this school does more than just grant a degree and send its graduates on their way. Over the years, the Ford School has developed means of staying engaged with alumni that go beyond their traditional fundraising and football, both important, I admit. Alumni who are willing and able to stay engaged with the Ford School can find opportunities to continue to grow intellectually and professionally because of that engagement. At least I certainly have, and I'm thankful for the opportunity. One way to stay engaged with the Ford School is through its students. And as Dean Collins mentioned, I've been pleased to employ a number of Ford students during their summer internships, including 4 who have worked with us in the Center for Defense Management Research at the Naval Postgraduate School. CDMR, our center, conducts research on management issues in national defense. Our goal is to provide research-based solutions to persistent issues of defense business management. We support the management agendas of current and future defense leaders with applied research that is timely, accessible, and useful. Your students have made significant contributions to this research with their strong analytical skills, their good writing ability, and their intellectual curiosity. Plus, it's just pleasant to have them around. I do want to single out one such student and acknowledge his assistance with this lecture. Nick Schroeder spent the summer with us working on a sponsored research project. He took my defense budgeting course as well, and he has continued to work with us even though he's now back here in Ann Arbor. He has made a significant contribution to this lecture, and I express my thanks, Nick. So with that, let's move to the substance of this lecture. Today's advertised topic is budgeting for national security. How much should we spend? This represents a new stream of research that we are just beginning to work on in our center. Our aim is to help defense and national security policymakers answer one of the strategic questions they are asking about spending for national security. Our approach to this research is to see if we can develop a new budgeting framework that will inform strategic, programmatic, and budgetary decision-making for national security. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says, in part, that Congress shall have the power to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But the Constitution provides no guidelines for how much the United States should spend for the common defense. And in fact, the Constitution says nothing about budgeting at all. It was not until the Budget Act of 1921 that a true executive budget for the United States was even required. It is difficult to reach a lasting consensus on the question of finding the right level of spending on defense. Some, like Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have argued that the defense budget should be pegged at 4% of GDP. Others, like the National Priorities Project, argue for an overall budget allocation that simply reduces defense spending in favor of domestic social programs. Defense spending is largely conditioned by externalities, and the right level of spending is almost always determined by political and military assessments of the defense environment, not by the size of the economy or the urgency of non-defense programs. In recent years, Congress seems to have been asking the President and the Department of Defense little more than, how much do you need? So while other countries may set defense spending as a percent of GDP, Japan, for instance, aims for 1% of GDP for defense, or other countries may base defense spending on other domestic factors. Chile, for instance, pegs its defense budget to national revenues from copper mines. U.S. defense spending, though admittedly constrained by budget realities, varies with the defense environment. So how much does the United States spend on national defense? Total outlays in the federal budget for fiscal 2008 amounted to $2.9 trillion. Of those total outlays, about $480 billion, plus another $187 in supplemental appropriations for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, or about 20 to 23% of total federal spending goes to national defense. Taking away the mandatory spending for things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other entitlement programs, interest on the debt, defense accounts for about 53% of the discretionary portion of the budget. That is, that part of the budget subject to annual appropriations by Congress. Currently, defense spending hovers around 4% of GDP. Trends over time show a decreasing percent of GDP devoted to defense and a decreasing percent of total outlays devoted to defense, with a slight uptick in the last couple of years. And in constant dollars, it historically varies up and down in almost a sine wave sort of pattern, largely in relation to world security conditions. But wait, the title of this lecture addresses spending for national security, not national defense. There is increasing evidence that national security and national defense are no longer synonymous terms, that there is a new definition for those activities that contribute to the common defense. If that's true, we need to change our thinking about what constitutes national security activity and how to determine what the U.S. investment in national security is or should be. So this lecture will explore the idea of resourcing for national security rather than national defense. We will examine some budget theory to understand why addressing this question from a budgetary perspective is reasonable. We will consider the notion of whole of government, what it purports to offer and how it's being implemented in some other countries. We will look at some current thinking among political and military leaders in the U.S. whose assessments of the national security environment go beyond the traditional force-on-force military actions between states. And finally, we'll make an initial attempt at constructing and analyzing national security budgets for the U.S. Let me again express my thanks to the Towsley Foundation for making this period of residence possible at this particular time. It's providing me the opportunity to embark on some potentially important research. And this is research, as I mentioned when I began, that we're just getting started about, but could have a tremendous effect on how policymakers think about resource allocation decisions for national security. We have a lot of work ahead of us on this topic, and it's my hope that our conversation today and during the period of my residence here will help us develop this research a little bit more fully. So to begin on this agenda, let's consider first the question of why we would look at budgets to address national defense versus national security questions. Caden, Giannakis, and McHugh view public budgets as representing the political aspects of resource allocation. And they argue, as do I, that budgets play a central role in policy making itself, that you haven't made policy until you've allocated resources. Wildofsky sees a number of policy-related facilitation roles for public budgeting, including setting expectations, making choices among alternatives, translating resources into purposes, making a contract among stakeholders and participants, and setting a work plan. The process of budgeting is the means of determining the nation's needs and investments, in our case today for national security, and for choosing among alternative strategies and purposes. Applying resources to those strategies and purposes means allocating budget dollars and setting expectations for performance and outcomes. Stakeholders reach an understanding about their relative roles and the expectations that attend to those roles. Moreover, as Wildofsky has pointed out, budgets offer a representation of government activity. When we look at that pie chart, we can see that budgets tell us the activities that government chooses to undertake and the relative importance or priority of those activities to the populace. A national budget that provides 23% of total resources for national defense and over 40% to income and health programs indicates the needs, politics, and priorities of that nation. But, and our central point here is, a budget that masks the non-military aspects of national security understates the nation's investment in national security and forfeits the opportunity for more holistic decision-making about resourcing for national security and the desired resulting accountability for performance and expectations. This issue of national defense and national security budgeting arises because national defense as a definition of national security may very well be outdated, or at least not applicable to current circumstances. National defense tends to ignore non-military national security activities that are involved today in confronting the non-state, non-traditional threats that exist. Air Force General Kevin P. Chilton, commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, describes this complex new security environment as characterized by population changes, competition for increasingly scarce natural resources, economic struggles, and bids for regional and global power. Technology, he says, is powerful to the point where a few well-placed computer keystrokes today can potentially match the impact of earlier generations' armed forces for good or for evil. Chilton argues effective modern deterrence requires a complex global understanding and the elegant execution of coordinated whole-of-government options to meet today's broad security challenges. Now, the idea of incorporating non-military activities in the U.S. government's operational definition of national security actually predates 9/11. For example, in 1993, President Clinton expanded the scope of the National Security Council to include a range of non-military security issues such as terrorism, narcotics trafficking, environmental degradation, rapid population growth, and refugee flows. In 2004, the Bush administration attempted to address the non-military post-conflict aspect of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with the creation of the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization in the State Department. Its core mission was to lead, coordinate, and institutionalize U.S. government civilian capacity to prevent or prepare for post-conflict situations and to help stabilize and reconstruct societies in transition from conflict or civil strife. According to an August 2006 fact sheet, this office was intended to promote consensus across government agencies. The project on national security reform, commissioned in the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act, sees these as the security objectives in this new era. PNSR argues that our national security challenges require effective whole-of-government integration, but that we remain dominated by outmoded, inward-looking, vertically oriented, competitive, stovepiped bureaucracies, close quote. PNSR's report recommends the U.S. focus on integrating efforts across the many departments and agencies that contribute to national security. For instance, they argue for merging the National Security Council and the Homeland Security Council to build a more coherent and unified approach to national security. It's possible that the Obama administration might be expected to embrace a more whole-of-government effort for national security. President Obama has appointed 5 former PNSR guiding coalition members and 2 working group leaders from the project to serve in key national security positions at State, DoD, National Security Advisor, and the Director of National Intelligence. In more practical terms, the Washington Post reports that Secretary of Defense Gates and Secretary of State Clinton have discussed the current overextension of DoD resources caused by the need for the Defense Department to engage in activities that go beyond the traditional scope of national defense. The size of the DoD budget and the resources at its disposal have made the DoD the provider of services that are beyond its historic warfighting role, now including economic development, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction assistance. These essentially non-military roles might be more the mission of agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, the State Department, Treasury, or even the Department of Commerce. Secretary Gates has said that lessons learned in recent operations stress the critical need to develop more deployable civilian expertise for conducting stabilization, reconstruction, and counterinsurgency operations. Moreover, Secretary Gates has stated that civilian institutions of diplomacy and development have been chronically undermanned and underfunded. Now, in advocating for other agencies to get national security funding, Secretary Gates is either a very unique cabinet secretary or he sees a really serious need to spread national security responsibilities to other departments. DoD's newest quadrennial roles and missions review report recognizes this need for an annual budget that shows a more holistic approach to national security programs alongside the traditional department-by-department approach. Similarly, National Security Advisor General James Jones said the whole concept of what constitutes membership in the national security community has got to embrace a broader membership. At the State Department, Secretary Clinton has talked about the need for the U.S. to use smart power, wherein the U.S. utilizes both its hard power and its soft power in the best combined way to provide for national security. She said, as individuals, as an organization, we need to work better, work smarter, and work together with more partners in and beyond our government. Well, knowingly or not, this push toward a coordinated and integrated government approach to national security is consistent with this emerging concept of whole of government. The concept of whole of government has been developed in some other parts of the world over about the past 2 decades. Christopher Pollard, a public management scholar in Belgium, defined whole of government to denote the aspiration to achieve horizontal and vertical coordination in order to eliminate situations in which different policies undermine each other, so as to make better use of scarce resources, to create synergies by bringing together different stakeholders in a particular policy area, and to offer citizens seamless rather than fragmented access to services. Whole of government can refer to cooperation between agencies within a single government or cooperation among levels of government. Whole of government reforms are generally seen as conscious organizational design or reorganization that call for political leaders to force cooperation between bureaucracies. The whole of government redesign attempts to shift existing bureaucratic structures in a way that forces collaboration and cooperation between agencies working in the same area. Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom have each adopted whole of government approaches. The Australian government determined that in focusing on defense, national security strategies and policies were too narrowly drawn toward conventional military threats. This was a focus that they saw did not protect against emerging non-traditional threats. The Australian government redefined defense to national security, acknowledging non-military vulnerabilities to Australian society, such as economic prosperity, diplomacy, national welfare, climate change, energy, infrastructure, industry, and the general nature of Australian society. They concluded we should rethink what we mean by security, develop different relationships with regional states, reassess the weapons systems required to satisfy our security interests, and increase aid to our Asia-Pacific neighbors. Accordingly, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Australia restructured its national security governance to accommodate this whole of government approach. The Australian National Security Coordination Council is now the government's highest decision-making body on national security. The council is chaired by the Prime Minister and consists of the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, the Treasurer, the Minister for Immigration and Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs, and the Attorney General. Research by the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra found that the greatest benefit of Australia's whole of government approach to national security is that the multidimensional nature of a security policy will allow Australia's limited resources to be channeled into providing deeper and more robust national security. Canada's model of whole of government was introduced in Canada's Performance 2002. It maps the contributions of departments, agencies, and crown corporations that receive appropriations to a set of high-level Government of Canada outcome areas. This whole of government framework is designed to improve reporting to Parliament on overall spending, performance, planning information for high-level priorities on which multiple departments are working towards related outcomes together. This reporting structure breaks down into reporting groups, departmental strategic outcomes, and program activities into 13 outcome areas with 4 broad spending areas. Each department or agency involved in a major government program must account for how it will align its activities with the overall government program, and it must gain approval from the Treasury Board. Funds are then allocated to agencies based on their contribution to specific government-wide programs. In the UK, a 1999 white paper called Modernizing Government called for the public sector to work in partnership across organizational boundaries to provide more integrated and seamless service delivery. This has resulted in reviews of spending across government organizations and the creation of cross-cutting governmental units and an acceptance of horizontal approaches to government programs. Well, 4 themes, I think, can be discerned in the arguments for a whole of government approach to U.S. national security. The first theme is that the existing system is out of date. This argument asserts that the existing defense system was designed to guide U.S. foreign and defense policy through the Cold War. The globalized world that the U.S. operates in today is much more complex than the bipolar world of the Cold War. Military strength relative to a traditional sovereign rival is no longer the only measure of national security, and the U.S. now faces a number of non-traditional threats against which the existing system is challenged to defend: terrorism, cyber terrorism, climate change, economic stress, disease, etc. Stovepipe bureaucracies are unable to collaborate adequately against these modern threats, and a whole-of-government national security system, it is argued, would foster collaboration and a better defense against modern threats. The second theme is that the State Department and other civilian security agencies are ignored and underfunded. Under the existing system, U.S. national security strategic priorities are demonstrated by the disproportionate share of the budget received by the Department of Defense. Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution argues in his new book, Budgeting for Hard Power, that a whole-of-government system for national security would incorporate DoD, the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and foreign operations in other departments. He argues for increases in state and DHS budgets to account for decades of underfunding, and he contends that these non-defense agencies or department budgets have not changed to reflect current security threats. Secretaries Gates, Rice, and Clinton, and even some military leaders have also argued that state, USAID, and other civilian agencies should receive much larger shares of the budget to improve national security. And they argue that diplomatic or economic development missions should not be undertaken by DoD. As Secretary Gates has explained, what is clear to me, he said, is that there is a need for a dramatic increase in spending on the civilian instruments of national security: diplomacy, strategic communications, foreign assistance, civic action, economic reconstruction, and development. The third theme is that the separation of the NSC, National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council creates an artificial divide between national security and homeland defense. Many argue that there needs to be a unified security council in which DoD, DHS, state, and perhaps the Departments of Transportation, Energy, Treasury, or other relevant civilian agencies are represented. And the fourth theme is that in this fast-paced modern world, the U.S. needs to have a flexible national security network, and that this network is required to respond to the multiplicity of threats the nation faces. The examples of Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 demonstrated at least an initial lack of flexibility and interagency collaboration. In foreign policy, the difficulties in reconstruction and counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan are indicative of the need for a more flexible system that can adjust to changing circumstances. So it is argued that a whole-of-government system would encourage interagency collaboration and flexibility to address this complex and changing national security challenge. Well, given the arguments in favor of a more holistic approach to U.S. national security policy and programs, how can the question of building a whole-of-government national security model be addressed? Well, one choice might be to address organizational and structural issues. It's been suggested that the NSC and HSC could be merged. More ambitious reorganizers might wish to create a new department or some sort of coalition agency from parts of existing departments, but we know recent experience with the formation of DHS suggests that massive reorganization in a time of war is perhaps not the best choice. On the other hand, simply merging NSC and HSC would seem to satisfy only the need for more coordinated policymaking at the White House level, without necessarily control over resources, and probably not without a certain amount of turf protection even at that level. The Project on National Security Reform cautioned that there would need to be measures imposed that so that foreign policy does not always trump homeland security. PNSR made a number of recommendations in this structure and process category, and they are listed on the first four on this slide. They suggest establishing a President's Security Council, creation of a White House advisor for national security, building an interagency personnel system and a new national security professional corps, and on Capitol Hill, forming select committees on national security in the House and the Senate. Organizational change is fine, but I think a second choice might be to try to build a national security budget. If, as budget theorists have argued, the process of allocating resources is where policy choices are made, political imperatives and citizen preferences are satisfied, expectations for agency performance are set, and the nation's priorities are represented, then building a transparent, whole-of-government national security budget might be a reasonable and important step. The PNSR made one recommendation in this area as well, and they said mandate an annual national security planning guidance and an integrated national security budget. Well, to begin to build a notional national, one immediately confronts a really difficult question. What activities to include? What constitutes national security? And what elements of federal departments and agencies and programs might rightly be included in an integrated national security budget? It certainly can be argued that a number of domestic agencies or activities contribute to national security, including economic affairs, transportation, infrastructure, even higher ed, for example. But many of those would fall predominantly, I think, under the Constitution's General Welfare Clause rather than under the Common Defense. So to develop a notional integrated budget, we began by looking at fiscal 2008 data from the President's budget request for 2009. We selected 2008 data because the data is complete and the 08 budget, the budget distortions caused by the economic recovery programs in the 09 budget are not present. So first, we simply aggregated the total discretionary budgets of the departments that are statutory members of the Homeland Security Council and the National Security Council, as if they were merged. The results are shown in this table. This approach has some appeal in its simplicity. It aligns with the PNSR's recommendations to merge NSC and HSC. It suggests an opportunity for more coordinated policy and budget decisions for national security. But it's not entirely satisfying. One reason is because it leaves out other agencies that engage in national security activities. And moreover, reporting the total budgets of these agencies would tend to overstate a national security budget because these budgets include a significant amount of spending for non-security programs. So, to attempt a more detailed notional national security budget, we next examined the apparent national security elements in the 2008 budget using the budget functions and sub-function classifications employed by the Office of Management and Budget. Since 1948, the executive branch has built and presented the executive budget using functional categories. By grouping together items that are functionally related, regardless of the agency that is responsible for them, this type of classification provides a useful summary of what the government is doing or expects to do, and in general, it focuses upon the ultimate purposes which government programs are designed to serve. OMB utilizes today 20 budget functions and numerous budget sub-functions under each of these to array the president's budget. Function classifications describe national needs, and the sub-function classifications represent the resources devoted to agency missions. Now you'll notice there's no budget function labeled national security. There's also no budget function labeled Homeland Security. But the 050 budget function, national defense, provides a reasonable starting point, we think. The 050 budget function already consists of funding for the Department of Defense, along with the atomic energy defense activities in the Department of Energy, and some defense-related activities in other departments and agencies, including DHS, Justice, and the Department of Health and Human Services, the Transportation Department, Selective Service, General Services Administration, and some others. Now, discretionary funding in 050 for fiscal 2008 totaled $603 billion, and DoD accounts for 95% of the funds in 050, but the spread of department and agencies in this function suggests to us a framework and a starting point for a national security budget function. So we attempted an integrated national security budget by budget function by simply looking at the sub-functions in all of the other functions beyond 050, identifying those that appeared to be national security related, and we reassigned them. We reassigned these existing national security related budget sub-functions to an expanded 050 national security budget function. And this array is shown in this table. This budget approach provides a more detailed portrayal of national security spending using existing categories of spending in OMB's budget functions and sub-functions, and it has some appeal. OMB could use an integrated national security budget such as this in the preparation of the annual president's budget, for instance. OMB would be able to further disaggregate the data to apportion the spending to individual departments and agencies, as it does now. Transparency is a little bit lacking in this approach, however. While budget functions provide a good organizing framework for OMB, they really lack clarity about programs and agencies that would be needed for Congress and the public to understand fully the scope and nature of funding for national security activities. So, to make an attempt at building a more transparent and complete whole of government profile of national security spending, we examined budgets and annual performance reports of the major cabinet departments and agencies, first to determine what budgets and activities they self-identified as related to national security, or which otherwise appeared to us to relate to national security. From this data, we constructed a notional integrated whole of government U.S. national security budget for 2008. And I'm sure the results of this effort are displayed in this table, which goes on for 2 pages. The results shown in this table indicate the difficulty with this approach. Identifying which individual programs to include in national security is difficult. Extracting them from their organizational context could be administratively and programmatically disruptive, and we have a hard time picturing making budget decisions from data that is quite this disaggregated. Nevertheless, each of these 3 alternative budget arrays has some merit. These are, of course, notional displays based on information available in public budgets and annual performance reports. But in Table 1, we simply presented the discretionary department budgets of the statutory members of the National Security Council and Homeland Security Council. That budget display surely overstates funding for national security, but nevertheless, the bulk of national security spending rests in those departments, and strategic and programmatic resourcing decisions would and could be made in and among these budgets. So identifying them for a more integrated national security budget seems to us to be a reasonable first step. Table 2 utilized the existing OMB budget function structure, changing the title to national security and reassembling existing national security related budget functions and sub-functions across the budget sub-functions across the government from their current functional categories into the revised 050. No organizational changes are required in the departments or agencies, but OMB would now have visibility over a more integrated national security budget function. In building the annual president's budget, the national security staff of OMB would have greater ability to shift resources among department budgets and between programs and appropriations titles to align the president's priorities and decisions of the NSC-HSC. In effect, this budget approach provides a better executive and administrative tool for making national security resource allocation decisions without causing process reorganization. Table 3 represents a first attempt to create a whole of government national security budget by identifying all those specific agencies and programs engaged in national security activities and arraying them in a single budget display. The type of budgetary information in Table 3 most closely represents a whole-of-government approach to national security budget. It certainly identifies agencies and programs engaged in national security across the U.S. government, and it makes for easy comparison of relative resource allocation. It also provides transparency for both citizens and policymakers. But in practice, I think it's a difficult approach to take. So considering all three, the second approach appears to us right now to be the most promising. Utilizing the existing structure of OMB budget functions and subfunctions and reassigning budget subfunctions to a new national security function uses a familiar process that would allow policymakers in both the executive branch and Congress to examine whole-of-government security spending within existing current organizational and process frameworks. The identification of agencies, programs, activities that constitute each subfunction has largely already been accomplished inside OMB, and the challenges of building a new list, as we attempted in Table 3, are avoided. So a couple more general observations can be made from this discussion of national security budgeting. First, it appears that the total U.S. national security spending could be as much as 20% higher than national defense alone. But DoD still has the largest share. Given the constraints on the overall budget top line imposed by the deficit and pressures from domestic non-security programs, it's highly likely that increases in non-DoD security spending would come from the DoD budget. If DoD and Secretary Gates are serious in arguing for non-DoD agencies to be more fully resourced for national security activities, they likely will need to be prepared to pay the bill. Secondly, determining what departments, agencies, and programs should be included in a whole-of-government national security policy domain is an inexact science. We have concentrated here on activities that are more or less clearly carry a national security label and are focused on influencing international conditions, but some may argue persuasively that their favorite issues, trade, immigration, environment, the economy, you name it, are also national security concerns and should receive the same priority attention. Even among international programs identified as related to national security, others might argue, development programs, cultural exchanges, humanitarian aid, etc., that they're not national security activities, while some would claim that they're inherently part of the strategic communications portfolio of national security. There are also activities which are not easily subject to budget transparency, intelligence activities, for instance, and we have not attempted to include any CIA budgets, for instance, in this analysis. Third, only discretionary and direct spending has been included in our analysis so far, and we've paid no attention to national security legacy costs. Mandatory spending for military retirement and healthcare entitlements are not included, nor is spending by the Department of Veterans Affairs, for instance. Using only direct and discretionary outlays for national security budgeting understates the true long-term costs of national security. Nevertheless, creating a national security budget gives greater clarity to U.S. national security policy and spending priorities. The share of the total budgetary pie for national security is clearly larger than is currently displayed for national defense alone, and the relative share for non-security discretionary programs is smaller than suggested by more conventional portrayals of defense, non-defense budget splits. Well, we've examined this issue of budgeting for national security to determine if spending for national security could be arrayed in ways that would portray a more holistic fiscal picture of total national security spending than is possible using current budget presentations. This inquiry is in response to proposals for broader and more integrated approaches to making and implementing national security policy. Some organizational changes might well help to achieve more integrated security policy making, but organizational solutions, I would argue, are not sufficient. Making and implementing national security policy requires making resource allocation decisions. National security budgets of some kind would be required to institute true whole-of-government management of national security. National security budgets can tell policymakers how much is now spent on security, where it is spent, and by which agencies. A whole-of-government national security budget could facilitate fiscal trade-offs, those required between alternative means of pursuing national security objectives, and they would provide for both transparency and accountability. It would also help to provide at least a partial answer to the title question of this lecture: how much should we spend? Baselines are important in budget making. A national security budget would tell us how much we are currently spending, a question that is quite difficult to answer using current budget data. Secondly, by facilitating trade-offs and transparency, a coordinated national security budget could direct resources to priority programs, reduce redundancy, ease program conflict, and eliminate low priority or poor performing programs. And third, a whole-of-government national security budget could provide lawmakers and citizens with a truer picture of national priorities. The struggle for resources between common defense security programs and general welfare non-security programs would at least be informed by knowing the true allocations of each. If the current administration is seriously interested in moving toward a more holistic approach to national security, we're recommending further research into creating a national security budget utilizing the budget function framework. At least that's where our head is right now. In the Center for Defense Management Research, we intend to continue and expand this research and to help inform this discussion. So, thank you for coming here today to listen to this lecture. I hope you found it interesting, perhaps a bit provocative, and now I look forward to your comments and questions. Dean Collins.
Thank you very much. We do have time for some questions and some discussion, and I would like to open the floor if there are any comments or questions that people would like to pose to Dr. Brook. Yes?
I'm curious. You mentioned member states of the British Commonwealth, but you didn't do a comparison between Germany or France, where budget and office of administration rapidly change. For instance, how much is spent in the Bundeswehr and how much is spent on the called border the border police. Mm-hmm. And there's also a very heavy expenditure for social welfare. And that covers what is veterans, what is others, and others emerge altogether. Mm-hmm. And you compare that, then you look at Russia, where the national defense has totaled the country gone down together with corruption. Now there is a certain amount of corruption in France, but the comparatively little that we know of in Germany. But it's interesting to compare them because both France and Germany have taken dislike to some American comments on what the banking situation that should never occur. And to most Europeans, that is a form of corruption, which is not necessarily. They may have corruption themselves, but they're hiding it, and they definitely do.
So, because we have some recording, I actually would like to have just a brief repetition of the question. I think that perhaps those in the audience heard, but may not be clear to those who are watching later. And so the question was a focus to request comparisons with France and Germany in particular, and there were actually a number of pieces to it, so I'm not sure that I can capture all of the dimensions. But perhaps I would also ask Doug if you would respond from the microphone so that it's possible to hear more generally.
Okay. The idea of comparing defense spending across countries is extremely difficult. I actually have a chart, I think, in my backup charts that will help us here. The most useful way for comparing defense spending or national security spending across countries is as percent of GDP. Because you normalize then for the size of those economies. If you do it just by total spending, of course, the U.S. is disproportionately high. And this chart shows you at least some comparison. This is 2007 data with defense spending in dollars on the vertical axis and percent GDP across the horizontal axis. And you can see there's a wide variation in defense spending if we look at it according to these measures. The difficulty, which this gentleman points out, is knowing exactly what's in these circles. because extracting data from some countries is not as easy as it is from others. They're confounded by issues such as border security and corruption that are masked in these. So the best we can do in international comparisons are rough approximations. And to the extent that we can, we get relative.
Has become now one of the strongest economic nations in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's common talk that the Fourth Reich is on its way. And many people don't know that Germany is probably the largest exporter of goods in comparison to other countries. And that to some extent means influence that's out of all proportion.
All right, I'm not sufficiently familiar with Germany's defense activities to comment on that, but I'll take that as being interesting.
Thank you. Are there additional questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, Doug, you've worn several hats in Washington, and I wonder if you could comment on this new idea that you're working on and how you think that might be received by the congressional community, by lobbying communities who work on different parts of the budget and so on, whether they're open to a new way of thinking about these things.
The question was whether there are reflections about how some of the different communities in Washington might respond to the novel idea, whether from Congress or lobbying groups or other groups who are active in Washington.
Well, I think the challenge here is to get over what we understand as turf protection and develop this idea of cooperation. I think Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton and Secretary Rice before her have made significant strides in building bridges across those departments. And so I think there's a strong, there's strong indicators in the executive branch of a willingness to do more cooperative budgeting, more cooperative policymaking. The difficulty, I think, comes on Capitol Hill and most particularly on Capitol Hill because of the structure that Congress uses to deal with defense budgets. You know, a bunch of appropriation subcommittees, each with well-defined areas that it works in, and they don't like to change. They like it the way they do. They like the way they do things now. That's why I think the OMB budget function appeals to us, because the executive branch and the Congress know how to disaggregate budget functions and reconstitute them into appropriations titles for the Hill. And so that's why we're more inclined to look at an existing framework as a way to accomplish this than trying to reorganize something and find that you get all of that inherent organizational resistance that you'd find otherwise.
Perhaps I could take the prerogative of the chair and ask a follow-up question related to that. I've been wondering if I could push you in what I'm going to call the kind of chicken and egg dimension of this. If I understand the proposal, I very much agree with the idea that unless one ultimately has some resources with the allocation in the budget behind the structure of the move to the whole government approach, it's actually unlikely to really have teeth and really be able to be implemented. Is the idea that by starting with a budget framework as you have proposed, that would actually make it more likely that the structural changes would then follow suit? Or so that would be in some ways a place to start as opposed to a comment about the relative priorities ultimately of structural changes versus budget allocation?
I think in practical terms, the place to start is the merging of the HSC and Homeland Security Council and the National Security Council. And I think that's all the further we have to go in terms of structural change. And then I think the next step is to deal with it on in a budgetary way. I wouldn't go further in reorganization, for instance. I think I'd turn to budgets then.
There was a question here. Yes.
How would the budgets for the intelligence services be integrated into this notion?
So the question was about the budget for the intelligence services and how that would be integrated.
In a non-transparent way. You wouldn't see them, but they would be there. Because presumably in this new, if we had this structural change for Homeland Security Council, if we merged those two councils, presumably the Director of National Intelligence would be a member of that new body. And he's got a budget, and inside the Situation Room in the White House, they could make those decisions. Are we ever going to see all of that intelligence money reported publicly? No. But our idea, of course, is that it is part of whole of government. It would be part of the whole of government approach to integrate the intelligence activities as well as all these other things we're talking about.
But has that rationale ever been examined? I mean, is it examined over and over again, and someone says we can't make it transparent?
So the question is about transparency, and I'm going to invite you to use the microphone so that...
Okay. Well, I thought this was working, so okay. I don't know. I've never worked with intelligence budgets, so I don't know.
Yes?
If for one moment we assume that the national budget for defense and national security budget, if the budget remains the same in terms of allocation, then we haven't accomplished what you had intended here, that there will be some shift in resources. How do you put in a mechanism in place for the kind of discussion to take place, for this shift to take place? Because that's what I believe, if that's correct, that you are at.
So the question is about how one puts in place a mechanism to accomplish the shifts and whether, in fact, there is the change in the proposal that he's advocating.
Well, you're certainly correct that if the top line stays the same and the allocation has not changed, then we haven't changed national security policy at all. That's correct. I guess our presumption is that this budget is part of an approach to national security policy that starts to ask questions about whether or not we have the proper allocation across these various departments, and that something different would result from that. You raise a very good point. I guess our presumption is that if we put all of these things in one place in OMB and in a combined security council of some kind in the White House, that something different will result. I suppose there's no guarantee of that, but that is sort of a fundamental presumption here.
And related to that is the lobbies that the previous question is. So one of the at Congress, and Senator Chuck Hagel talked about a 21st century architecture for global security, saying that there is interdependence between countries, nations, South Asia, China, the US, Europe, Japan, and so on. So how can there be a link? In other words, how does this consensus, it seems to me the consensus will drive a shift in allocation, and interdependence, or some kind of interdependent architecture that would come forward. So it seems to be all these concepts are out there trying to relate, and it would have to pull these together so that the U.S. can then say, China takes its fair share of the global defense burden. There is a sense of global security that China would enjoy, or other countries.
So the question was asking for reflections about how to move towards recognizing the global interdependence and the extent to which these are very much global concerns which will require some type of sharing, and how does one move forward in a way that integrates those dimensions as well?
Well, I think your description, I'm sorry I missed Senator Hagel's presentation. He's a longtime friend, and I would have liked to have been here for it. I think your description is exactly right. There is a lot of this stuff out there now, both in the international domain and inside the U.S., sort of the sorts of things that I talked about in the first part of my presentation. It's sort of John Kingdon's garbage can model of public policy, and it's all in there. We're waiting to see which policies emerge and how they get formulated. And I'm merely suggesting one of the ways to address all of that stuff that's out there. But your description, I think, is very accurate.
there any additional questions? Yes.
Recognizing that this might be outside of your zone of expertise, I was wondering, I mean, given your knowledge about the breakdown of the budget, if you could offer any opinion as to, in a broad sense, which parts of our national security might be significantly underfunded or which might be overfunded.
So the question was about whether there might be some parts of our budget that are currently underfunded and others that might be overfunded.
Well, I'm loaded with opinions. But I think I would associate myself with Secretary Gates' comments that the non-military, diplomatic, and developmental activities are underfunded and have been underfunded. Not only been underfunded, but they have been underprioritized as to their potential contribution to our overall national security posture. And we have relied too much on the Department of Defense and relied too much on our military capability, our warfighting trigger pulling capability, and also on the notion that our armed forces are capable of doing anything. Because they're disciplined and have resources, we can make them nation builders tomorrow or humanitarian aid deliverers the next day and whatever. And that may not necessarily be the case. So I would associate myself with Secretary Gates and his view of spreading the responsibility here.
Thank you very much for forward-looking and provocative discussion about a topic that is so important for all of us. And we do have a reception that will be held outside of the room. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here for our Towsley Policymaker in Residence Lecture, and especially I would like to thank Dr. Douglas A. Brook for his thoughtful comments and his remarks.
Susan, the caterer has been detained, but if people can stick around until 5:30, we promise you great cookies.
So please join me perhaps in thanking Dr. Brook and